active listening. Before we dive in, actually, though, just a little bit of housekeeping. We've got the chat box open today, so please do get involved in the chat. Please do remember to be polite and courteous, of course, but you can use that for a bit of networking purposes if you would like, or just a bit of chit chat. If you can keep your microphones on mute, that would be fabulous. And if you're able to turn your cameras on, it's not only nice for me, but it's also nice for everybody else to have a look and see that they're not the only folks in today's session. If you are eating a particularly messy lunch at this particular time, maybe do keep it off. Today's session, I'm just going to be presenting to you. The slides and the recording will be available for you after today's session as well. So please do watch out for those. I'm not one of these speakers who just reads off of the slides. So if you want to take notes on what I'm saying, please do. But don't feel you need to scribble down everything that is on the slides, because they will be available for you. Now, this is where we're going to go over the next hour or so. Well, we're going to address that first question there of what is active listening, making sure that we're all on the same page when it comes to that. We're then going to have a little look at what is involved. We're going to be playing a couple of games, and we're going to be looking for a little while on body language as well, which, as we'll see, plays a key part in active listening. So let's go to chapter 1 then. What is active listening? Well, the idea of it comes from counselling, actually. And it was two chaps back in the 1940s, Carl Rogers and Richard Farson, who are the two chaps in the photo. I don't know who the other person wearing the poncho is, but that's somebody else. Now, back in the 40s, the idea of counselling was still quite new. And unlike in today's society, where there's, a healthy encouragement for folks to go and speak to people if they need it, back then it was held with a lot more suspicion and actually considered a taboo in some elements of society. And that would continue for decades. But the two of these, these two gentlemen were early adopters. And they were completely sold on the values of counselling, and they actually worked together to look into what makes an effective counsellor, because back then in the 40s, nobody actually knew. And so they did a study, and they came to a conclusion, actually, that listening, and listening well, is not a passive activity. It's an active activity. Active listening is in the name, isn't it? In other words, you have to be involved in the process of listening rather than just letting it happen to you. They wrote a paper in 1957, and let me just read a quote to you that sums up active listening quite nicely. They said, where is it? There we go. People who have been listened to in this new and special way become more emotionally mature, more open to their experiences, less defensive, more democratic, and less authoritarian. In other words, they feel more valued, and so they become more open. And so what we're looking to do on this session is to take that idea that was refined in a counsellor's chamber and translate it to our everyday engagements. Nobody is expecting you to become a counsellor overnight, and some of you might do quite a lot of this automatically. But what we're looking to do is unlock a kind of diet active listening, something that you can wheel out as and when you need it, eventually and hopefully to the point that it becomes natural for you. Right, first and foremost, active listening is more than hearing the words that are being said, though, of course, hearing the words that are being said is really important. It's about focusing on what's being said verbally and also physically. But it's also understanding this, and it's responding to this in a thoughtful, constructive manner. It's about making the other person feel heard, actually. Now, if you don't do it, the person's at risk of feeling ignored. If you do it too strongly, then the person's at risk of feeling patronized. But if you get it broadly right, it can help build relationships. It can create clear understanding and open up communications with folk. It can lead to effective conflict resolution. It can lead to better decision making, better problem solving. There's loads of really lovely wins from the simple steps of active listening. And I think above all, it helps the speaker feel valued. It helps them to feel respected and to feel heard. And we all like to feel valued, respected, and heard. But Dave, what exactly is it? Well, there are a few key elements to get a grasp of. And as such, active listening is a kind of process where actually it's a skill. And as with all skills, it kind of grows with time and with practice. Some of you might pick this up fairly easily. Others of you will maybe take a bit longer. You know, we all pick up things at different speeds, don't we? I am, I think, on day 261 of learning Spanish on Duolingo, and I can't really speak Spanish yet. It's taken me a while, but also leaning into Spanish, I picked up the game of paddle in about 10 minutes. It just came naturally. We're all different. And actually, the understanding that we are all different and being open to that is a part of active listening. And we'll see that in a minute or two. So the first element then, paying attention. Now, stick with me here. The latest figures from scientists tell us that there's over 2 trillion galaxies in the universe. Now, 2 trillion is a really very, very, very big number. To give us a bit of perspective, 2 trillion seconds is 63,500 years. If we go back 63,500 years, humans hadn't invented farming and we were only starting to dabble in cave drawings at that point. So 2 trillion galaxies. Now, our galaxy, which is just one of those 2 trillion galaxy, there's about 100 billion stars. And that's another number that's far too big to grasp. But if each of those stars was like the size of a penny and it was placed and they were placed next to each other, and if we got in a car and drove along that line of pennies at 70 miles an hour, which is quite quick, it would take us 3,000 years to get to the end. Now, 3,000 years ago, the Phoenicians were busy inventing our alphabet for us. But the thing is, and stay with me here, those stars are not nice and neatly next to each other. In fact, if the sun was indeed the size of a penny and it was placed in Edinburgh, I'm up in Glasgow, if it was placed in Edinburgh, the next closest star would be in London and there would be nothing in between because it's space. There's a lot of nothing in space. And actually, if we spaced out all of humanity between our real sun and the nearest star, equally distanced, our nearest person would still be 3,000 miles away, which is the distance between you folks down in Southend and the folks living in Dubai. And so we've got 2 things going on here. The first is that there's so much stuff in the universe that we can't quite comprehend the numbers. But it's so spaced out that it seems to be empty. And this, strangely enough, is challenge number 1 when it comes to active listening. When you're active listening, as far as you're concerned, this person speaking to you is the only other being in the universe. Nothing else is happening. But the reality is different, isn't it? In reality, there are lots of things in the universe. And actually, at any time, there are lots of things vying for our attention. So step 1 in active speaking is to try and stay focused on the speaker, not on what the person is doing over their shoulder, not on your phone that's just buzzed in your pocket with a notification, not that thing that happened to you that they've just reminded you of that you're desperate now to tell them because so you can be part of their story. It's just them that we want to be focusing on. I mean, you have a little look around you now. What distractions can you see? I've got a window over here, and things happen outside that window. I've just had a notification pop up that I've had an email coming through. I mean, you might be distracted by this silly little piece of art that my children made me on the wall, or my guitars that are here. There's distractions all around, and it can be helpful to break down these distractions into different categories. So first, there are those external distractions, like a phone vibrating, for example, or somebody clicking a pen, or an email coming through, those kind of things. But then there are other elements, like a noisy environment, background noise. Song comes on that you like and know if you're like me, you're singing along to it without too much warning. An uncomfortable seat can even be an external distraction for you. And if it causes you to fidget, it's maybe going to break the spell. Now, I know that sounds a bit daft. It sounds a bit extreme in a way, but it's proven by behavioral scientists that if you're talking to somebody and quickly glance at your phone, or if you're talking to somebody and glance at a door, that person generates feelings of, this person doesn't want to listen to me, they want out of this conversation. That's exactly what we're trying to avoid with active listening. The person speaking to you is the only thing in the universe. But then those are physical distractions. But there's other kind of distractions as well, isn't there? There's mental chatter. I once went for a MRI scan. And in an MRI, you kind of lie on a thin bed and then you get transported into a tube, and then magnets whiz round, and through some kind of magic, they take photos of your inside. And when you're inside an MRI scan, it's really important that you stay still, because you'll end up blurring the photos, and that's not very good. And it takes a while for it to happen. Now, I was told that I was going to be in this tube for about 40 minutes. But that was okay, as the scanner person offered to put on some music, and they give you a panic button to press if you need to get out. Now, I have a lot of time for people who work for the NHS. They are some of the best of us. But these particular people forgot to put on the music for me. But not going to press the button, male pride and that kind of thing. But it was only 40 minutes. So I thought to myself, right, I'll go and do a little meditation. Some people call it having a nap. I didn't. I called it a meditation. And I know that lasts for exactly 23 minutes. It's just the way that I work. So then it would only be another 15 minutes or so, and I would be free and released. But it wasn't 15 minutes. Eventually, I was in that tube for an hour and 20 minutes. But the duration wasn't actually the worst part. The worst part was that I only had myself for company. There was no TV, there was no music playing, I didn't have my phone, so I couldn't distract myself by doom scrolling, that kind of thing. And I have absolutely no idea how people tolerate me. I drove myself bonkers. Literally, to one point, I was in a cold sweat because I thought it would be fun to pretend that I had been buried alive. That was a massive mistake. It was ridiculous. We're all alive with thoughts. You see memes going around about, what to do with those intrusive thoughts that come in. I mean, many of you are probably doing a bit of daydreaming or going down on little thought tangents during this session already. Because sometimes, quite often, if we're honest, we are the cause, or we are the worst cause of our own distractions. We're thinking about what we're going to have for dinner, or what we need to get from the shops on the way home. We're maybe thinking about the person who complimented our shoes or gave us a wee cheeky wink on the bus, which made us feel quite good. You may be worrying about the leak that you've got in the bathroom that you still can't fix, or if that flash that you saw on the motorway is going to result in a speeding ticket for you. This kind of internal noise happens for all of us, and it's completely natural. But it's not what we need in active listening. It's something that we need to try and push against, and it's hard, but you get better at it with experience. If that happens, just give yourself the grace that that's a normal thing to happen and guide yourself back into the conversation. Should you have completely lost track of what the speaker's saying, it's okay to say, I'm sorry, you gave me a thought. It caught me by surprise. Could you just repeat that last bit that you said, please? That's okay to do, especially when you're not an expert at active listening. So that's one kind of mental chatter. But then we have a different kind of mental chatter, one that comes with our programming. And it's full of our prejudices, our biases, our needs, and our wants. We're not perfect people. Well, I'm sure you are, but I'm definitely not. But we do, and we do need to try and approach every conversation with an open mind. That's what active listening is about. Even if you disagree with what the person's saying, it's important to stay in the game if you want to learn, if you want to understand, or at the very least, not waste your time in this situation. And that kind of brings about the final point for paying attention, keeping it all steady. Sometimes you might be triggered by what somebody says. When I say triggered, I mean that it elicits or it triggers an emotional response. It could be good, it could be bad, and that's okay. Just try your best to listen objectively. If your heart breaks as you listen, try to put that to the side, but definitely deal with that later on. Counsellors who do this kind of thing for a living only maintain their accreditation if they have regular appointments with counsellors themselves, because things do need to be processed. Good things need to be processed, but bad things also need to be processed. And negative responses are a risk for us as well. This isn't the session to go into conflict resolution. And actually, conflict resolution shouldn't really be on our agenda with active listening, which does need to have limits, but we won't go into that in too much detail. If somebody says something and you do have a really negative reaction to it, take a moment. Take a moment to regain your composure and bring yourself back to the subject at hand. Listen, if it's that bad, you need to pretend you need to go to the toilet so you can just take a few deep breaths outside the door, then do that. This is really unlikely to happen for most folks, but we need to say it. I think I need to say it mainly because of one of my own biases. So my first job in the charity sector, I've been working in the sector for 20 years, over 20 years now, and I've been actually a beneficiary right the way through from childhood. But my first job was as a street fundraiser. And it was a fantastic job for a young adult, which I was at the time. I had loads of fun, built loads of resilience, raised thousands of pounds for charity as well. But I can still feel all these decades later that dark, anger-driven passion that welled up inside me when I was on the main shopping street up here in Glasgow, and I asked a woman for £3. Now that £3 was going to prevent 10 children from getting polio. That's a pretty good exchange in anybody's book. But she said to me that those children probably deserved to die and she wasn't going to give me any money. Now, I flew off the handle at this woman. Only time that had ever happened. I'd been punched, I'd been kicked, I'd been called names, but the only time that I really flew off the handle was with that woman. And actually, I had a really good boss who came over, well, pulled me off the street, actually, came over, heard the story, flew off his rocker as well, and then made me go and get a hot chocolate until I calmed down, because Oxfam don't like their people shouting at other people in the street. That really triggered me, and I was young. I didn't react to it very well. And when we work in the third sector, we are at maybe a bigger risk than everybody else at getting our emotions battered, just because of the interactions that we have on a daily basis. We have amazing joys, but we have real lows as well. And it's a warning worth heeding. Listen to yourself. when you're active listening, and make sure you take care of yourself. Anyway, paying attention. Yes, paying attention as best you can, the kind of key foundational element of active listening. And these other elements we're about to talk through, hopefully, will make this a bit easier. So element number 2, showing you're listening. So paying attention yourself is one thing, but that's all about you. Here, when we're showing we're listening, we're shifting that focus from you to the person who's speaking, actively listening, actively letting them know you are listening. Sorry. So for verbal, showing you're listening, you've got these verbal affirmations, which is a fancy word that means, uh-huh, mm-hmm, go on, right, oh, I know, really, wow, oh, no, she didn't, maybe not the last one, but the rest of them. It's really important that you don't overthink your verbal affirmations. Just make sure they come out like you would do if you were talking to somebody on the phone. It needs to be natural. If it's not natural, if it's forced, it's weird. So just be natural. Just relax into that. But there are also non-verbal signs that you are listening. Let's go back to street fundraising. So street fundraising, basically what happened is I got paid to flirt with middle-aged ladies from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. I mean, that was it. And I was really quite good at it as well. In fact, I was so good at it, I met my wife, who wasn't a middle-aged woman at that point. Not that that matters. I'm getting slightly embarrassed now. Age gaps, they're fine. They work for people. It's fine. Anyway, so slightly distracted now. There was there's a skills, like a common skill exchange between being a good listener and being a flirt, actually. With both, apparently, because I've forgotten how to do it now, you should laugh and smile and chuckle at the right places. If they're sharing something sad, you share that sadness. You don't smile irritatingly at them. You let your face show that you're listening. But even you've got more to work with than just your face as well. Even over Zoom, for example, have open body language, palms open, relaxed. Don't have your arms folded across your chest like this. Just let your legs do their own thing. And if you want to know if somebody's paying attention to you, have a sneaky look at their feet. If their feet are pointing towards you, it's a good sign that they're paying attention to you. This comes from behavioral science. I love behavioral science. Your posture speaks very loud as well. Don't slouch, but then again, don't be too upright. Do lean forward, but not too much, because that's weird. But just enough, eye contact, hugely powerful, can be really awkward. We'll talk about body language a bit more in a while. If you can, it's quite hard to do this, but when you're talking to somebody and you just get that realization that you are properly involved in that conversation, likelihood is you're active listening without thinking about it. And if you can kind of just switch off from that conversation a minute and just see, right, what are my hands doing? How am I standing or sitting? What's my posture like? You can learn a little bit about yourself. If you're doing it in an office situation and the office has got CCTV that you're allowed to watch back, which I know we don't all have a little look. See if you can actually watch yourself. It's amazing what you can learn from your own behavior. Just when you're active listening, please don't play with your hair, as that is just flirting, and there's no place for flirting in active listening. The other thing you can do here to show you're listening is you can try to mirror the body language of the person who's talking to you, because they're talking to you with their voice. Of course they are, but they're also talking to you with your body. And if you can kind of try and mimic or mirror their body language in not an odd, forced way, but if you can try, if they're standing, you can stand. If they're sitting, you can come down to their level. If they're avoiding eye contact with you, you avoid eye contact with them. It helps it become more accessible. Now, body language, as we'll talk about in a second, is hugely similar between people, but it is not by any stretch of the any stretch of the imagination universal. I remember once I was working for a medium-sized charity up here in Scotland, and I was hauled into my manager's office because I was fairly new to the organisation, and the big boss, so my manager's manager, didn't like the way that I slouched in my chair when I was working in the office. She had a complete rod in her spine. I mean, maybe not in her behaviour, because she got my boss to talk to me instead of coming to me directly, to tell me to stop slouching, basically. But I've got scoliosis. My spine looks like a letter S. And for me, when I'm sitting upright, it's actually painful. And so I tend to recline when I'm sitting because, like you, I don't really like pain. And there was a reason that my body language wasn't what she was expecting. And it was a very good reason, actually, and she never mentioned it again. And understanding and thinking about mirroring that body language can actually help erode those maybe cultural or health related differences in body language that can crop up all too much. I think we'll pack body language there because we're going to talk about it in a little while, and we'll go on to the next element here, which is providing feedback. Now, as much as we would like them to, not everybody is going to pick up on those cues that we've just given them, those verbal cues, those non-verbal cues as well. So we need to try and make it more obvious for folk. Now, when I was first taught active listening, I was told that you should repeat back what people said to them, kind of like a parrot, where you would parrot it back to them. And that was really terrible advice, because it's so unnatural and it's so forced, and it just raises more barriers than it's supposed to break down. But actually, the idea is the right idea. Very simple one for us to maybe get our head round. But really good active listeners, they put themselves in the shoes of the person they're talking to, or at least they try to. And that's really, really very crucial. Never pretend to know exactly how somebody's feeling. That's unless even if we have direct experience of what they're going through, we're still not them. But that doesn't mean you can't add an extra layer of just loveliness by trying to access empathy. Empathy is not a competition. Empathy is not pity. It's about being able to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. And when you combine empathy with the questions that we had on the previous slide before I got cut off, then we have something really meaningful. So there are some essentials. And now what I want to do is go through some enforced fun. We're going to have a little quiz. Now, doing sessions on active listening over Zoom, it is quite hard to get a bit of, practice in, unless we put you all in breakout rooms and got you to do some role play. But I think you would all just leave the call because people don't like role play, do they? So what we're going to do is I'm going to read you a story. Okay, it's a story created by AI and edited by me, so it made sense. And after that story, I'm going to be asking you some questions on it. Now, when you're active listening, you tend to be able to do it in maybe a more formalized environment. And it is perfectly okay when you're active listening to be taking notes about what that person is telling you. Perfectly fine to be doing that. Actually, it can be quite a helpful way of, pushing out other distractions that are coming along. So if you want to take some notes on this story that I'm about to tell you, feel free. And then I've got some questions that I'm going to ask you about it. So the story is called The Interview. Emma was running late for her job interview at Trotter's Independent Trading Company in central London. It was a Thursday morning, and her interview was scheduled for 10:30. She had planned to take the 9:45 Northern Line from Camden Town, which would have got her to Leicester Square by 10:15, gave her just enough time to walk to the office building on Shaftesbury Avenue. As she rushed towards the station, she noticed dark clouds gathering over the London skyline. The BBC weather forecast had mentioned 30% chance of rain, so she quickly ducked into a Tesco and purchased a small Union Jack umbrella for £8.50. It was cringy, but there's nothing worse than arriving at an interview soaking wet. The cashier was an elderly man, and he somehow reminded her of Maggie Smith, but he wished her good luck. She didn't know how he knew. When Emma reached the station, she discovered that the Northern Line was, of course, partially suspended due to signal failures, typical Thursday chaos on the London Underground. The next viable route that would get her there wouldn't arrive until after 10:30, which would make her late. Panicking, she called her contact at the Trotters Independent Traders, Cassandra Trotter, and explained the situation to Cassandra, who was understanding, and rescheduled her interview for 11:15. With a bit of extra time now, Emma decided to get breakfast on the Bridge Street Cafe near the station. She ordered a cheese and Marmite toastie with a large Earl Grey tea, which came to £6.75, surprisingly good value for London. While eating, she reviewed her notes about the Trotters Independent Traders, a company that specialised in sustainable packaging, with 87 employees across 3 offices in London, Manchester and Edinburgh. The rain had started by the time Emma hopped onto the Piccadilly line. During the journey, she struck up a conversation with another passenger, Dr. James Wilson, who coincidentally worked in a building next to Trotters. He mentioned that he was a huge Doctor Who fan and that his sister once worked at Trotters and had enjoyed the collaborative working environment, comparing it with the Great British Bake Off. Emma arrived at Leicester Square at 10:35, and thanks to her umbrella, she stayed dry during her 12-minute walk through the crowds. She entered the reception of the 8-storey building feeling confident and prepared, despite nearly bumping into somebody who looked remarkably like David Jason. The interview went exceptionally well, and 2 weeks later, whilst watching Strictly in her pyjamas, she received an email offering her the position of a project coordinator with a promise that this time next year she'll be a millionaire. There we go. Sometimes in active listening, what the person's telling you isn't all that interesting as a whole, but in it are going to be some absolute golden nuggets that you need to have paid attention to. So let's see how well you do with these questions. I'll give you a question. I'll give you 5 seconds to see if you can come up with the answer, which you can just write down and keep to yourself. And then I'll reveal the answer and we'll go through. So the first question is, what was the name of the main character in the story? You can write down your answer there. 4, 3, 2, 1. It was Emma. If you got the name Emma, give yourself a point. If you said Anna or Emily, then you don't get a point because that's not the person's name. And it's very important to get people's names right. Question 2. What tube line did she originally plan to use? 2, 1. It was the Northern Line. Question 3. How much did she spend on the umbrella and on breakfast? Now, this requires a bit of maths, so I'm going to give you 10 whole seconds for this one. 5, 2, and the answer is £14.25. £8.50 for the brolly, £6.75 for brekkie. Question 4. What was the name of her interview contact? I was expecting that to be tea, but it was coffee and it was cold. It was Cassandra Trotter. You can give yourself a point if you got that. If you said Cassie, because you recognise that name from maybe somewhere else, you can give yourself a point as well. What was the name of the cafe that she had breakfast in?
The Penguin.
It was the Bridge Street Cafe. There we go. I'll tell you what, if you've got more than 3 out of 5 there, I think you're doing an amazing job. If you've got 1, you're on par with me. Right, let's go and have a look. We've got 5 more questions to go through. What was considered worse than a cringy umbrella? Different one this time. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Being wet at an interview. What 2 celebrity lookalikes did she bump into? 5, 3, 2, 1. Well, the guy in Tesco who looked like Maggie Smith, and somebody who looked like David Jason running out of Trotter's Independent Traders. Question 8. How was she feeling when she entered the office building? Well, she was feeling both confident and prepared. Give yourself half a point if you only got one of those. Question 9. How was her mood when she found out that the tube was running late? There's one specific word that was used here. She felt panicked. That was the word. That was the way that it was described to us. And the last one. Was her choice of breakfast a good choice? Absolutely not, because Earl Grey tea tastes like perfume and it is horrific. When people tell you a story, they can sometimes be a wee bit long. Like that felt a wee bit long. And not all of it is going to be relevant. And as you get better and more practice with active listening, you automatically start somehow to hone in on the parts of the stories that it's important to remember. And it's also a very rare thing that times or numbers are as important to remember as emotions, as names, and as connections. Stories with numbers are rubbish stories. Sometimes they're important. The vast majority of the time, they're not. If you want to go to the chat and show off how many you got right, please do feel free to do that, but there's no pressure on you there. If you got more than half of them right, well done. That's actually a surprisingly tricky activity to do. Now, if you are going to the chat and showing off, I'm just going to flick onto the next slide and quickly go through some key findings about body language. So the first thing is about body language, that it often conveys emotions and intentions more accurately than the spoken word does. We're also wired subconsciously to read body language and be affected by it as well. But it is important to understand that context is huge when it comes to body language. Context of the situation, context of the culture you're in, context of the individual as well. And that means that a single gesture can have lots of meanings depending on the context. But that's just like a single word can have lots of meanings depending on the context. Take the word rose, for example. Rose. Do I mean the flower? Or do I mean a line of chairs? Or do I mean to move a boat? Or am I talking about the eggs of a fish? Or am I talking about standing up? If you know the context that I'm using the word rose in, you don't have any issue understanding what I mean. And it's similar for body language, actually. Something that body language, or a place that body language plays a real part in, actually, is inconsistency. You know, where the words are saying one thing, but your body language or the body language of the person is maybe saying another. If that's the case, more often than not, the body language is the one that's holding the truth for us. I was working with a client down in Hertfordshire, not too far away from you, and I was interviewing a child, a very casual interview, but I was interviewing a child. And their language was overly aggressive, and it was violent language they were using. Now, on its own, that would really be quite a worry. But his body language was much, much less confrontational. He wouldn't meet me eye to eye. He stood side on to me instead of facing me in that kind of aggressive manner that, well, if you're going to lump someone, you need to look at them, don't you? And so there was something else going on. His body language told me that there was something else going on in the background. And I discovered from talking to one of the teaching assistants, because we were in a school, that was his first week at school. And he didn't know the names of anybody. I was in on the Wednesday, I think. And so he didn't have any friends. So, of course, his kind of aggressive attitude was one of self-protection in this weird alien environment that he found himself in. He was feeling alone, he's feeling isolated, he was feeling defensive, and this bold bearded fella was suddenly asking him loads of questions about something that he didn't know about. I don't know why they asked me to talk to him, but anyway, his body language just showed that there was something extra coming along. So, main elements of body language. The face, of course, the face is the most expressive part of our body, and it's our main channel actually for body language. Smiles, frowns, blushing, what people's eyebrows are doing, that kind of thing. Now, unlike the other elements on this list, what happens with the face, it's kind of universal to humanity. There's not much cultural deviance or deviation, when it comes to the face. You're hardwired to understand facial expressions. You've done it since you were a baby. And of course, that's where you want to start, the face. The eyes are a bit different to the rest of the face. Eyes are much more cultural. But let's cover some quick basics with the eyes. Staring can be perceived as aggressive, but if you get it right, it can be one of the best ways of showing somebody that you're listening to them, is eye contact. That's why I love on Zoom for a few people to have their cameras on, because I can look into your eyes and you have no idea whose eyes I'm looking into at the moment, but I can. So thank you if you have got your camera on. There was also a study back in 2006, back when video chat was first launched, that found that eye contact, even over video chat, where we don't properly look into each other's eyes because we're looking at the screen and things, even that kind of attempt at eye contact helped people remember 30% more of what the other person said. Eye contact is hugely useful for us, but it is not appropriate through all cultures. Actually, there was another little study, the University of Paris, back in 2014, I think. They did a study that discovered that eye contact also helps you be more aware of your own body language. They couldn't figure out precisely why that was, but their best guess was that when you have eye contact with somebody, you become acutely aware of them watching you. And so you're just subconsciously more considered about your own body language. Quite interesting, isn't it? Gestures is next. Gestures, things you do with your hands. I talk with my hands, as you can see on Zoom. Starts to get a bit murky here, because different gestures mean different things in different, ethnic groupings, different cultures, even different families have different gestures. The main danger of gestures and body language within active listening is we start to do something that distracts the other person. Cracking our knuckles, being overly dramatic with our reactions and hand movements, things like that. See, when I was saying at the start of that little of the little quiz that we did, it's okay to take notes. Sometimes having a notebook and a pen in your hands can really help rein in the gestures if you are somebody who likes to gesticulate. Posture. We've talked about posture briefly before, but it's also, posture is an important one when it comes to dynamics of that conversation. If you're standing over somebody, it's a position of power. and it's usually counterproductive to the purpose of active listening. The same can be said if you're in a senior role and maybe somebody comes into your office to talk to you and they're standing, but you're reclined back in a very relaxed way. That's another power move. And an imbalance of power doesn't help active listening. Slouching can also show insecurity. It's all context dependent. Leaning forward, that's a really good indication throughout cultures that you're actually listening to somebody and you're interested in what they're saying. Just sitting up and leaning forward slightly, leaning into the conversation, in other words. The movement of your body is a mix of gestures. It's a mix of your posture with that as well. You know, how a person moves, how you walk, if they fidget, they can all be understood in the same kind of way as talking with your hands and talking with your body as well. The last one on here is personal space. Typically, the less personal space that somebody needs, the more comfortable they are feeling in their situation. But of course, we are all different with that as well. And some people crave proximity to an unhealthy extent. But if somebody is comfortable coming close-ish to you, it means they're already trusting you and they're probably going to be more open because of that to talk to you and share what is important to them. There's a lot of ambiguity in body language, but there's also a lot of internal programming that we have to fall back on. So just being aware, firstly, of your own body language. Is there anything that I'm doing that is going to be prohibiting that person talking to me? That's where you want to start. But then, you know, quite quickly after that, just have that little thought of, is what that person's telling me with their body matching up to what that person is telling me through their words?